My name is Dave O'Connor, and I'm a professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, coming to you from today. And Madison is a city of about 300,000 people. We have a large university. We're also our state capital. And I started working on HIV here back in 1998, studying vaccines. And this was right at the start of the ARV era. I wouldn't have believed that just more than 2 decades later, we would have pre exposure prophylaxis that could be taken once every couple of months. I wouldn't have believed that treatment of people with HIV could prevent them from transmitting the virus to others. And it's been just an amazing journey to see the progression in HIV over the time that I've been working on it. I also wouldn't have believed that we would have a devastating pandemic that would arrive in Madison, where we would need to draw on lessons that I've learned from working in places like Brazil and sub Saharan Africa on HIV. And in the last year, the key lesson has been that we need to help where we can, when we can. And we need to try to help in our own communities in our own way. And so for me, that's meant sequencing viruses so that we can understand how the viruses are spreading in and around Madison, in our state of Wisconsin. It's also meant bringing testing into schools so that we can try to make it safe for kids to go back into schools. And we've been able to draw on a lot of our lessons, learning from places that have effectively managed to do HIV research and implement HIV programs in really difficult settings. And one of those that I think deserves special note is the Rakai Health Sciences Program, which brings a variety of HIV prevention tools to a very rural part of Uganda and have really been at the forefront of HIV prevention and implementation research for several decades. And when I had an opportunity to visit Rakai back in 2010, I remember thinking about how incredible it was that they were able to do all of this community centric research in such a difficult setting and try to show what works in a relevant representative community and then extend it to other communities that have broadly similar problems. And what we're trying to do here in Madison is use that same sort of model, is where we're going to try to figure out how we can respond effectively to COVID, and then we're going to try to show how those best practices might be usable in other places. And so a lot of what we can study and understand about COVID comes from the work that's been done on HIV. And the HIV epidemic and the COVID pandemic are intersecting. We know that in 2020 alone, sadly, more than 100 million people were forced into extreme poverty worldwide. And we know that that sort of extreme crushing poverty is associated with a greater vulnerability, and that includes vulnerability to HIV. There's been a lot of worry that HIV treatment programs, which have been so valuable at extending lives and improving people's health, might be threatened by COVID. And in fact, it's been estimated that treatment disruptions could increase HIV mortality by 10% within the next 5 years. However, it's good to know that UNAIDS has been monitoring this, and in the 22 countries where there is enough data to look at this through 2020, there has only been a decline in HIV treatment in 5 of them. So that is a sign of good news. And one of the things that's been a silver lining has been that necessity has been the mother of invention. And COVID has required some rethinking about how some HIV delivery programs are operating. For example, places are now distributing longer duration sets of ARV prescriptions. So instead of getting 30 days, someone might get 90 days or 180 days of pills. Now, in terms of the actual biological interactions of HIV and COVID, it The data is still somewhat mixed and it's still somewhat early. So we need to say that everything here is tentative, it is subject to change, and even among the existing data, there is some contradictory information. The best study that I've seen came from the UK, where they found that individuals who were living with HIV seemed to be at increased risk for COVID 19 mortality. And this association with increased mortality held even after adjusting for social differences, ethnic differences, and other comorbidities like smoking and obesity. There's also been studies from the US showing that people with HIV are more likely to be admitted to hospital with COVID 19 and are more likely to die of COVID 19 than people without HIV. However, this data is still controversial, and some other studies have not seen the exact same effect. And so, one of the key lessons is that we just need to stay tuned because the data is going to be complex and is going to take a while to shake out. However, we know from studies of other respiratory diseases like influenza that low CD4 counts and not taking antiretroviral drugs does increase the risk of influenza complications. And so there's reason to think that people who have HIV might be at higher risk for COVID 19 complications. It's also important to note that the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommends vaccines for other diseases, even for people living with HIV, and that includes the influenza vaccine. What this means is that when vaccines become widely available, it's going to be really important that people who are living with HIV sign up for those vaccines, take the vaccines, even this their bodies and make their immune systems vulnerable to other diseases. Vaccines are really strong, elicit strong immune responses, and those strong immune responses are sufficient to be protective against other diseases. And there's no good reason to think that it's going to be any different for COVID 19. So I think that when people with HIV have the opportunity, they should absolutely go to get their vaccines. Now, when we think about vaccines, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how is it that we have a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 in just a year? It's been 40 years. We don't have one for HIV. Why is this? Well, it turns out that making a vaccine for the novel coronavirus is easier in two key ways than making a vaccine for HIV. The first is that the SARS coronavirus doesn't evolve very quickly. There's much lower viral diversity in SARS-CoV-2 than HIV, which means that a vaccine has the fairly easy job of eliciting an immune response that's going to work against pretty much all the viruses that are spreading around the world. Now, there is a lot of recent worry about the emergence of novel variants or novel strains in the UK and in South Africa and some other places, but it's important to contextualize this. We're talking here about 10 or 15 genetic changes in a 30,000 genetic letter genome in SARS coronavirus. And we see that kind of variation in a single person living with HIV over the course of just a year of infection. So the coronavirus simply doesn't change. It creates an easier target because the target is stable. It also benefits from having a protein on the virus's surface, the spike protein, that is a good target for antibodies. It's an easy target. We know this because different types of vaccines, whether they're inactivated vaccines or adenovirus vaccines or mRNA vaccines, they've all shown that they can work. And they all work because they target the same viral target, this spike protein. In HIV, we don't have that kind of easy target. We have to be much more clever, and we have to target parts of the virus that are really, really hard to see. Nonetheless, all of the work that's been done on COVID vaccine development benefits from the work that's been done on HIV. And one of those is that we need to create options for end users who can then have choices and can learn to um, use the vaccines for COVID-19 effectively. There's a real danger of misinformation, and there's a real danger that the vaccines are not going to be able to be delivered to marginalized communities, and that some communities and some countries could be left behind by vaccine programs for COVID-19. It's also important to say that not only is the messaging that we've learned in HIV prevention important for COVID vaccines, but the vaccine platforms themselves for HIV had their origins. I'm sorry, for COVID had their origins in HIV. So some of you might remember that back in 2007, there was a large phase 2B HIV vaccine trial that Merck was running called the STEP trial. And that vaccine trial didn't work. It was it was a very difficult time for those of us who are working in vaccines. However, that STEP trial used adenovirus vectors, which you might remember hearing that word adenovirus when you hear about the AstraZeneca and Johnson SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, because they've improved upon and modified and learned from that information about HIV to develop rapidly these vaccines that seem to work against SARS-CoV-2, at least in the case of the AstraZeneca one. The Johnson & Johnson one's results are still pending. Still, even when we have vaccines, we're going to need non-pharmaceutical interventions, and we have to worry about how to message it so that we don't give people a false sense of security that allows them to put themselves at risk while their immunity is developing and while their vaccines might be protecting them, but might not be protecting others in the community who have not yet been vaccinated. So what are we going to do in terms of treatment for COVID? Well, this is a place where I don't think we're going to see as much innovation over the next year or two. And that's because with the COVID-19 infection being so brief, the best antiviral drugs are going to be able to work on the virus when the virus is around in really high levels. And when you have such a short period of time when the virus is around at high levels, and most people don't know that they've been infected very early on, it's very difficult to target drugs to that particular narrow window of time. This might sound really familiar to those of you who are familiar with the HIV life cycle. In HIV, when people are newly infected, they tend not to feel very much at all for the first month of infection, when they're most contagious and when there's a lot of immunologic damage being done, especially in their guts. Similarly, we think that about half of SARS-CoV-2 transmission occurs when people are not yet feeling sick at all. And so just like we need to have harm reduction and messaging strategies for HIV that account for the fact that there's a lot of transmission among people who don't know they're infected, we need to be doing the exact same thing for COVID. Now, where are we as scientists? Like, what have we learned and where are we going? A lot of the people who are working on COVID also are HIV scientists. People like me who work on HIV and other emerging diseases have turned some of our research attention to studying SARS-CoV-2. And unlike in the early 1980s when HIV emerged, SARS-CoV-2 is emerged in an era of the internet. And in fact, I would say that this is the first internet-enabled pandemic. And that has both its good and its bad. In terms of the good part of it, we now have the ability to rapidly share and disseminate new scientific information on preprint servers, which are websites where scientists can publish their data as soon as it is ready and as soon as they've interpreted it without going through the lengthy process of having their science reviewed by peers and published in an official journal. It allows for global working groups to be convened on a moment's notice, and it allows for large data sets to be made available and shared with scientists around the world so that people can analyze and reanalyze the same data sets to make sure that we come to an agreed upon consensus when analyzing some of the same data. And it also means that we can monitor epidemics that are occurring in the entire world all at once and very quickly. And as an example of this, when the R4P meeting had its first organizing meeting in Cape Town last January, many of us started talking about working on COVID 19 because the internet was bringing us news of all of the cases that were occurring in Southeast Asia. However, there's also the downside of this internet enabled pandemic, which is that social media can distort reality. Someone can get a vaccine and then get into a car accident and say that the vaccine caused their car accident. It can be easy for misinformation to spread, and in addition to misinformation that's malevolent or just really intending to distort, it's also very easy for dated information to be spread and recirculated well after it's lost its recency and might have been changed by newer, more timely data. And so it's really important that there be a holistic response within communities. And this includes journalists, it includes scientists, doctors, the community members, influencers, local celebrities, all working together to get the best information out there. Because as we get into 2021 and beyond, that information is going to be driving the decisions that people make, the behaviors that people take, and how well we respond collectively to the virus. And I'll end on one example of this that's particularly meaningful to me. So in August of 2020, the state of Wisconsin, where I live, had 700 or so new cases of SARS-CoV-2 each day. And the state of Victoria in Australia, which is where the city of Melbourne is located, and I'm an honorary professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne as well. They also had 700 cases of new infections each day. And the way that our two states responded could not be more different. Victoria went into a very strict lockdown, very difficult, but they were able to wrestle their number of cases down to zero without a vaccine. Until recently, they had had about 2 months without any local cases. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, we took a very different set of actions, which included a lot of recommendations, but very few requirements for distancing, for mask wearing, for taking the sort of, embracing the sort of behaviors that we know can protect against the virus. And our cases climbed sadly into the many thousands each day. So, where do we go from here? I think that we all need to pull together, the scientists, clinicians, non-governmental organizations, and especially journalists, to try to get the accurate information out there, to try to communicate to people the importance of taking collective action to fight the virus, and to make sure that we don't fail to learn from what we've experienced and how we've grown since the emergence of HIV in the 1980s. There's been so much work, high quality research, randomized clinical trials, basically trial and error, to figure out how to reach affected populations, how to reach vulnerable populations, how to try to ensure equitable access. All of these lessons are going to need to be absorbed into the COVID response. And conversely, we're going to need to take what we've learned from COVID and we're going to need to turn the lens back on HIV. We're going to have to ask whether some of the lessons that we learned from the COVID vaccine work can apply to HIV. So, for example, could we run 5 large clinical trials simultaneously instead of running one after another? Would that be a good idea? Would that accelerate the development of new prevention products for HIV? And we're going to have to think about HIV as one of several coexisting global infectious disease problems. And of course, for those of you who come from parts of the world where there's endemic malaria or there's endemic dengue fever and other serious viruses, this might seem obvious to you. But in other parts of the world, like where I am in Madison, Wisconsin, people have typically not had to think very much about infectious diseases. And so, this idea that there's going to be persistent viral threats and potentially new virus threats that we're going to need to continue to respond to in our lifetimes is something that needs to be communicated. And I'm really so glad that as journalists, you're here and you're willing to take up the fight and you're willing to help. And of course, scientists like me are always here to answer questions that you might have. Thank you so much again for participating and enjoy the rest of the meeting.